I appreciate the opportunity, Ed. So all of you should be just seeing that first title page. Is that correct? Where it just says called up, ball players remember becoming major leaguers?
Yes.
All right, very good. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. Let me tell you a little bit about myself first. You got a little bit of an overview. As referenced previously, a former chair of the Dusty Baker Sacramento SABR chapter up until just last month. Also, the advisory committee of the Pacific Coast League Historical Society. My great uncle played in the old Pacific Coast League. So, as a kid and young adult, I got to follow him around to his reunions. So I built a huge love for the pre-1958 baseball out here. And prior to the Giants and Dodgers arriving in 1958, the Pacific Coast League was really almost the quality of a third major league. Um, when I was a kid, I was lucky to discover Lawrence Ritter's Glory of Their Times when I was relatively young. And since I discovered that book, it has been my favorite. What I loved about the book was, although some of these players were even a century older than me, I was able to connect to them as human beings. The way that Ritter presented their stories is really more of a human interest angle. So we were able to get an idea for them besides just ball players. So I've always kind of gravitated to those human interest stories and especially those first person narratives. So that's what this book is structured as, called up. They're all first person narratives. Now, like all of us, I would imagine the vast majority of us dreamed that one day that we would be playing in the major leagues. However, I hit about 200 in Little League. So when you hit 200 in Little League, I'm all for people pushing ahead and trying to reach their goals. But when you hit 200 in Little League, you kind of have to figure that that's probably not the avenue you're going to have to take to find your passion in baseball. But so I decided to get into writing. Pursued that. Going into college, and then at that particular time, it was in mid '90s, so the internet was just really kind of starting. I kind of saw the writing on the wall that those jobs would be few and far between. So ultimately, I decided to major in business, kind of put the baseball writing on hold. But now, at this point in my career, and this point in my family life, with my kids being a little bit older, I was able to kind of revisit that love of baseball and baseball writing. As referenced, my great uncle used to play in the Pacific Coast League, and he was what would be called a phantom major leaguer in 1946 with both the Boston Red Sox and Boston Braves. So, phantom major leaguer, meaning that he was on a major league roster but did not get into a game. He was a pretty big prospect in the late 30s and early 40s. He was actually purchased in the same deal as Dominic DiMaggio by the Red Sox. But obviously World War II happened. He spent a few years overseas, and when he got back, he made the team out of 46 spring training. However, the services of a near 32-year-old rookie with no major league experience, who had been in Europe most of the last few years, were not needed. So he was released after just a few weeks. Next day, picked up by the Boston Braves, who was there for about a week. Same thing happened. Got released without getting in a game. Now, I always, he's one of the inspirations behind this project. And I wish I had a little bit more. I wish I had some more conversation. We had some great conversations, but I never really asked him about those few weeks because I knew that there was a level of disappointment in not getting into not getting into a game and being an official major leaguer per se. So if you see those photos there, this is my first little league photo. This is me as a right-handed Will Clark for Halloween, I want to say in 1988 or 1989. And then this here is a collage of photos with my uncle, related to my uncle. So about the book is a collection of 109 first-person player stories. They're all original interviews. And what I wanted to capture more than anything else, more than game details, anything, was the feelings and emotions of becoming a major leaguer. So these stories are going to have behind the scenes, how they got the news, who were some of the first people they called, what was the orientation process like, what it felt like to, run out on that field for the first time and play Major League Ball. Um, so player debuts range from 1961 all the way to 2018. So the first player in this book is Sudden Sam McDowell. Came up with the Indians as a young 18-year-old, played, I believe, in just one game, 1961. The most recent player is actually a player that's still playing. He was in the majors through last year. I believe he just signed on with KBO, and that's Patrick Wisdom. He came up in 2018 with the Cardinals. The last few years he had been with the Cubs. So major league service time is pretty broad. Ranges from just 2 days all the way to over 2 decades. So there's one phantom major leaguer that I included that had 2 days in the major leagues. I wasn't originally planning on using those phantom major leaguers. Again, that was, a player who had been on a roster but not in the um, in an official game. So that's, I have one of those guys 2 days. And then on the opposite end, I have Jerry Royce. We probably all heard of Jerry Royce. Spent 22 years in the big leagues. So quite a broad variety of big leaguers in this book. So I kind of debated internally about how I would present these stories, and ultimately I decided to do it by time frame sections so it could kind of capture some of the common themes that were going on that impacted call-ups during those times. So 4 different breakdowns: 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s, and then since 2000. Nearly all teams are represented. I believe the two that are not represented, when all was said and done, were I don't believe I have anybody from the Diamondbacks or the Astros. However, for your sake, I do have a lot of twins. So that's and I'll share a few twin stories in this presentation as well. So the time frame sections. So I wanted to kind of gather these call-up stories based upon some of the things that were going on in baseball during that time that impacted major league call-ups, impacted the game of baseball. So the 60s and 70s, obviously a huge, there were decades of expansion. Many minor leagues disbanded. Amateur first amateur draft was held. So that kind of changed how players were getting teams, obviously. Labor relations improved as well. Towards the end of the 70s, there was more movement from players. So there are 17 players that are represented from the 60s and 70s. 1980s starts off with, well, not starts off, but 1981, there's a labor strife, the strike. There's actually a few stories in the book that are impacted by that 1981 strike. 1980s also, obviously it started a little bit before the 80s, but 80s were really when you started seeing more relief pitchers. So, and the role of closers. So, obviously that impacted how players were putting together their rosters. So you'd have more, pitcher heavy rosters, and there'd be more ups and downs from pitchers. Rosters for a few years were cut from 25 to 24 players. So obviously that's less players that are in the major leagues. 15 players are in the book that made their debuts in the 1980s. 1990s, another decade of expansion, 26 to 30 teams. More labor issues, 1990 lockout, 1994 strike. There are a few stories in the book that are impacted by both of those. Changes to the disabled list, too, impacted the frequency of major league roster changes, obviously impacting and increasing the number of players that would go up and down. The 42 players in this decade. So that is the largest representation within the book is the 1990s debuts. Since 2000, obviously, there's been a little bit more of an emphasis on statistical analysis, obviously, ground before that, but how you analyze players, how you fill in rosters accordingly, um, uh, is something that impacted those roster moves. Minor leagues, have obviously been restructured once again pretty considerably. Um, Also, more changes to what's now the injured list, making roster changes even more frequent. 35 players are from this particular time frame. And then I didn't have this for any particular decade, but I put a little, a little um, Earth, a little globe guy with a bat, indicating the rise in international talent. Obviously, that impacted how players were, pursued and go up through the minor league ranks to the major leagues. I gave you a little bit of background on the book. I want to give you a little bit more background on the stories themselves. So, again, it's a collection of first person human interest stories. And the goal, as I had indicated before, was to capture what can't be obtained from reading a box score or reading a regular article on games, the feelings and emotions of becoming a Major League Baseball player. As I had indicated, what it felt like when your minor league manager calls you into his hotel room or calls you off to the side and plays a joke on you or gives you that news that you're going up to the major leagues. Who are you going to call? Do you call mom, dad, a coach, your wife, your fiance, whoever? What's it like? Some of these guys had never been, shoot, some of them hadn't even been on a plane. Now they're riding first class to the big leagues. What's it like to walk into that major league clubhouse, and seeing that spread for the first time when you're used to eating peanut butter and jelly on the road? Um, but the first question I asked these players was, when did you realize you had the talent to become a Major League Baseball player? Now, I didn't necessarily ask this question because I wanted them to say when I was a senior in high school or when I was in college or when I was in double A. Now, some of them, answered that question that way, but that question also sparked memories of mentors along the way, what their development was like in those particular times, the ups and downs, where they actually really put things together and made that connection that this is a realistic possibility for my life that I could become a major leaguer. Um, the first person narratives have been edited only very minimally from the interview transcripts. So they are, if somebody said, me and him or him and me, I wanted to read like spoken word. So there will be a little bit of, grammar inconsistencies. I wanted readers to feel like they're being told the story directly from the player. And I think that I did a good job capturing that. Now, if somebody had said, I came in the fifth or sixth inning, or I pitched, two innings and a third, and I found the correct amount, then I would, clarify that in the text. But otherwise, these are the words of the players. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with a few stories. Um, First off, this is the breakdown of players that made their debut with the Twins. Now, the Twins do have a kind of a special place in my heart because I don't know how many of you are able to make the connection, but I'm wearing a early 1990s Visalia Oaks hat. Now, the Visalia Oaks were the California League at the time high A affiliate of the Minnesota Twins. So I saw some of these players at the minor league level in A ball before, talking to them for called up many decades later. Some of them also, had played for the Oaks that ended up, making their debuts with other teams either. But, that really kind of connected a special connection to me for the Twins. So the first player, the first as far as chronological order, Steve Luber made his debut with the Twins in 1971. He actually is kind of interesting because he ended up pursuing a career as a coach in professional baseball afterwards. And when I did the interview with him, we played phone tag for a few times, and he would be calling me up from the road at like 11, 12 o'clock at night, whatever his time was after games. So he finally connected. Um, Jeff Rubley came up 1992 with the Twins. Mike Trombley, 1992 with the Twins as well. David McCarty is one that's really kind of near and dear to my heart because I saw his first professional game in Visalia. Um, and unfortunately, he passed just a little bit less than a year ago. But it was really kind of cool to see his professional game, have him be one of my favorites. As I watched him progress and become a major leaguer, and then kind of get to know him through this book project. And realize that one of my baseball heroes was also a pretty good guy. Um, so McCarty, 1995, Marty Cordova. Obviously, probably he was the rookie of the year for the American League that year. I got to see him play in Visalia as well. Um, and then AJ Atcher came up with the Twins in 2014. And he is 46th, I believe it was a 46th round pick. So he's one of the lowest draft picks by the Twins to actually reach the major leagues. So that's one of the interesting elements of his story. So I'm going to share a few different Twin stories. And then if we have a little bit of time, I could share a couple others, non-Twins. But first one, Steve Lieber. Comes up with the Twins 1971. He was a 13 round pick by the Twins in 1967, called up in his fifth pro season. Made a debut against the Brewers. Um, but let me give you a little bit of excerpt on how he found out. Um, he was being called up to the major leagues. He said, "We were in Little Rock when Harry Warner was the AAA manager with Charlotte. When Harry told me, my mom and dad had come down from Missouri to see me pitch. So they were there for that. My parents were excited. When I was growing up, my dad was still playing men's league hardball around the region. He had played a little D League pro ball before I was born, and he had hoped for myself or my brother to make it. Back then, there was still the old custom where veterans weren't really hot on young players. They feared for they were going to be going after their jobs. However, I was fortunate. Jim Perry and his family were very gracious to me, and we became very good friends. Rod Carew, Tony Oliva, Cesar Tovar, Harmon Killebrew, all those guys were very good to me coming up. So, played in five big league seasons. Um, and again, as I had indicated, he had pitched. He actually pitched until the late 80s professionally before becoming a coach. He actually played in the senior league as well in 1989 and 90, I believe it was. I think he played in both those parts of years. But here is his orientation process and how he gets into his first big league game. It says, the manager was Bill Rigney. He knew me from spring training, but that was about it. The pitching coach was Al Worthington, and I'd only spent about 20 days or so in spring training with him, so he didn't really know me either. It was a week before I pitched. I was told I was going to start the first Monday after I got there. Then they didn't tell me until 2 hours before the game that I wasn't going to start. I wanted to throw a bullpen, but they told me to hold off. They said, you might pitch in relief today or tomorrow. So if you don't pitch, you may throw a pin on Wednesday. That's what happened. Then they said, you're either going to start on Friday or Sunday. It was really up in the air. I didn't get to pitch until that Sunday. I was used to pitching every fourth day and relieving between starts. All of a sudden, I didn't pitch. I got out of routine. And the first time I pitched, I wasn't sharp at all. I just muddled through it. Um, so he had a kind of a rough start to the major leagues. He had actually had in 1970 and 1971 incredible minor league seasons where both of his ERAs in both of those seasons were well under two. All right. So Jeff Rubley came up when the Twins 1992 10th round pick in 1986. I believe he actually played for Visalia in 1986. Called up in his seventh professional season. So quite a few bus rides, but he still played in 12 big league seasons. So if you think about that, to play in seven minor league seasons before getting your call and still being able to be in the big leagues for over a decade is quite an accomplishment. So I'll read you his how he found out he was going to be getting the call. We were traveling to Edmonton for a game. It was snowing when we were ready to land. My roommate on the road was Chip Hale. He had been in the big leagues before, and we were buddies. He was Mr. Optimistic. Oop, let me move over here. I'm sorry, I skipped down. And he was telling everybody we were still going to play, even though it was snowing. Everybody knew we were not going to play. We went to the hotel and I got a message from Scott Olger, the AAA manager on the hotel phone. He said, "Hey, I need you to come up to my room." Chip said, "Hey, don't forget to ask him whether or not we're playing." Okay. I figured Scott was setting up something where they'd have me say they're making us clear the field, but it wouldn't really happen. It would be a trick on Chip. Well, I go into the room, I knock on the door, and Olger's there with my roommate at home in Portland, Jim Kamen, who was the trainer. I thought that was a little bit odd. He was going to be in the room. Scott's like, "Hey, I got some bad news for you. You didn't pass your drug test." I looked at him and I had a few choice words. I said, "I will piss right now." They chuckled and said, "No, you're going to the big leagues." I went back to my room and Chip was there, of course, still. He goes, "What did they want?" I said, "Well, I'm getting called up." He was excited for me. We enjoy the time in our rooms. But a few minutes later, Chip's like, "Hey, did you happen to ask him whether or not we're still playing?" It was typical Chip. All right. So this is his big league debut. Very interesting big league debut because he comes in as a pinch hitter. He's 0 for 1 and he strikes out. But there's a twist here. Okay. He's up against the Red Sox, and Tom Bolton is the pitcher. Bolton's got a good curve. The first pitch he throws me is a curveball, and I think I swung when it was halfway there, like I was expecting a fastball. I missed it by a mile. Then he threw me a fastball up, and I fouled it back. The next pitch, he throws me another curveball. He bounces it, and I think it barely caught the dirt in front of the Minnesota turf. It was probably a 55 footer. I didn't even get close to it. Of course, I swung again, but it was so bad that it bounced over Tony Pena's head. I struck out, but ran to first and made it to first on a punch out. Our first base, yeah, our first base coach's name was Wayne Terwilliger. He was a much older guy, but a super positive, awesome guy, and a great coach. Sounds like somebody is on not on mute. Uh, but um, so I get on first, and he's totally excited. He's going, "Man, that was great." I'm going, "Twig, I struck out." He goes, "Reb, anybody can get a hit or even a home run in their first big league at bat. I guarantee you, in the history of the big leagues, nobody's ever got on first from a strikeout in their first at bat." The first baseman looks at me, shrugs his shoulders, and says he's probably right. That is Jeff Rabelais' uh, experience as first big league game. One of the things too, what was cool about that coach Twig was he actually had in his first professional season, he was actually teammates with my uncle for a short time in the early 50s. Next one, we have Marty Cordova. Marty Cordova comes up with the 1995 Twins. He's a 10th round pick by the Twins in 1989. Makes the Twins opening roster in 1995, the start of his seventh professional season. So here's his, how he finds the news out. But give him a little, I'll give you a little background context as well from his story. In 94, I was playing in AAA and had a really good season. I would have been in the majors that year as a September call-up, but obviously we went on strike. Then the next year, the next season, we started on strike and they had replacements for 1995 at the beginning. I knew I was going to get an opportunity to make the team if we got back to playing ball. Once we finally settled the strike, Tom Kelly played me nearly every inning of every game that entire spring training. Nobody ever does that to somebody because it's such a grueling season, but I think he just wanted to make sure I had the ability to play. I was fortunate because of the strike. Shane Mack, who was our starting left fielder, went to Japan. It opened up left field. There wasn't a strike. He may have stayed in the United States, but he wanted to make money and leave. That was fortunate for me. I kind of knew I was going to make the team because the position was open by default. I had a really good spring training. I probably hit about 320, maybe even higher, but Kelly waited until the last minute. It may have been the last couple of days before they finally pulled me off the side and broke the news that I was going to be uh, when he called me into the office and said, "You're going to make the team." All right. So he gets into what is the first game of the season, and it's at Fenway Park. He's playing left field. He is 0 for 3. And let me mute that. There we go. Let me get back to my screen here. Okay. Um, all right. Now, somebody had just muted everybody. All right. So um, let me get back to this. Okay. So let me go back here. Sorry about that. I was doing the muting. Um, so he's 0 for 3, but he has a little bit of a hiccup in his second major league at bat. He says, during my second at bat, I had a 1-1 count and I swung. I was so nervous the bat flew out of my hands and went into the stands. They were booing because I had to go back and get my bat. I'm like, you got to give the bat back. They passed it back to me, but they were all booing me from the Fenway Park crowd. Then the next pitch, I struck out. Walking back to that dugout was a very long walk in Boston, and the fans were brutal yelling at me. So that's Marty Cordova's interesting, orientation to the big leagues. And he ended up playing 9 big league seasons. All right, so I don't know where we're at as far as time goes. Ed, do we have enough time for one more story, or do we? You want me to wrap it up for Q and
No,
A?
no, go ahead and one more. We're
Okay,
enjoying
very good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and first I'll talk to you about. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and skip over. All right, so Bobby Grich. Well, Bobby Grich is a SABR favorite of a lot of folks. He comes up 1970 with the Orioles. At the time, he's playing for the Rochester Red Wings. He's just having a phenomenal year. I think he's batting behind. I think he's batting in front of Don Baylor. And obviously, the Orioles were stacked at that time. They were stacked at the minor leagues as well. Um, but he's actually told by Cal Ripken Sr. he's going to get brought up to the major leagues. So he gets up to, he gets told that he's going to be going to the big leagues, and he goes to Memorial Stadium in Baltimore. Has kind of an interesting introduction with Earl Weaver. We all know that Earl Weaver was an extremely warm and fuzzy guy. I'm being very sarcastic. Um, But he goes into Memorial Stadium. He's walking into the clubhouse, and just out there, he sees a door for the manager's office is kind of cracked open. He peeks in. He sees Earl Weaver. He figures to do a little knock and say, "Hi, my name is Bobby Grich. I'm here for my first day in the big leagues." Earl Weaver doesn't get up. He doesn't shake his hand, say congratulations. He just looks up and says, "Do you have anything else to tell me?" He said he was really kind of taken back by that, but that was just kind of Earl Weaver's personality, as far as how he was as a major league manager. He kind of had a clear distinction as far as how players had to earn his respect, but definitely created a little bit of weird tension early on. So he gets on the bus. Eventually, Bobby Grich and the team get on the bus to go from Memorial Stadium into Washington to play the Senators. Now, the pitcher for the Senators that particular day was got by a guy by the name of Casey Cox. Now, Casey Cox had actually attended the same California high school Bobby Grich did, although he was a few years older. So in that game, Bobby Grich is 0 for 3 with a walk. Okay. The next day, he walks into the Orioles clubhouse and there's a cake front and center waiting for him that says, "Welcome to Baltimore, Bobby." All right. So this is his story regarding that cake. Frank Robinson and all the other guys come in. He says, "Who bakes a cake for somebody who gets a walk? You didn't do anything last night. You got a walk. What's this cake all about?" He was giving me a hard time. I said, "Well, come on in, guys. Go ahead, have a piece of cake." Pete Richard took a piece of the cake and then took a bite. He goes, "Wait a minute. That's sour cream icing. Dude, smell that." I start to smell it, and he goes, "No, put your nose a little bit closer to it." I heard somebody kind of giggle. I knew right then and there they were going to throw my face down into that cake if I got close enough to it. It was a total setup. My instincts picked up on it. I jumped away. He tried to push me down. I think maybe the tip of my nose hit the cake, but that was it. So they didn't get me. That was the first time I'd seen that prank played. Anytime there was a rookie being called up during the season from there on out, I was in on the joke. We got a bunch of rookies after that. They would go up, smell a cake, someone would come up from behind them and slam their face into it. It was pretty funny. That's Bobby Grich's orientation to the big leagues. All right, I'm going to go back. All right, so what I'm working on right now is a project called Next Up. It's on post-playing career transitions. So a lot of the players that are going to be in Next Up were in my first book, Called Up. And what I really wanted to give readers was a better understanding of what players face when they hang up their cleats. The vast majority of these guys that play Major League Baseball, especially during the eras that I spoke to them about, were not guys that made a lot of money. They were guys that had to nearly immediately get into additional careers. So it really kind of tells about their transition into normal jobs per se. And I also want to do this because I think it will help other players with their transitions. It's quite a challenging time, not just financially and finding that second career, but also it's kind of an identity thing. I mean, imagine being a professional baseball player, and that's basically all you do until you're 30 years old or so, maybe 35 if you're lucky, and then all of a sudden you have to find something else in a matter of possibly just a couple of months. So interviewing players right now, I've interviewed 27 players so far. This book will have longer stories. The average called up story was about 850 words or so. The first few next up stories were closer to about 3,000. So instead of 109 players like I had in called up, I'll probably have closer to about 30 or 35 players in this next book. And hopefully within the next year and a half or so, sometime in 2026, I'll have that released. All right, so that brings me to questions and answers. Definitely would love to answer any questions that any of you may have. I just recently sold out of my personal inventory but I do have some books coming from McFarlane probably the middle of next week. If you would like to get a book directly from me. Also, if any of you are on social media, if you type in just Zak Ford, make sure Zak is spelled goofy. My parents decided to go with ZAK. Zak Ford, and then called up or next up, it should pop up in those searches. But obviously, the book is available on Amazon directly from McFarlane. But obviously, not that I'm in it for the money, but I definitely get more books are sold direct. So definitely would appreciate your consideration. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing now, but I'll be available for any kind of questions any of you may have. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yeah, let me get this on gallery view. I see Stu and Bob already have their hand up, but I'll take the prerogative as host to say you don't have the name Edmonds that your father, grandfather, and great grandfather had. So the fact that your name is spelled ZAK is not nearly as bad as EDMUND, last name EDMONDS. So I got you. I've got one up on you there.
That went right over my head until you brought that up. I was like, okay, good point. Yes.
No, the other thing that I always thought was strange is that people thought then that my name was Edward Edmonds. And I thought, as stupid an idea as Edmonds is, Edward Edmonds makes even less sense to me. But anyway, let me mention a couple things that I got out of reading the book and let you comment on that. And then I'll keep a queue and I'll put Stu and Bob next up in the queue. One of the things that I noticed is so many players talking about how nervous they were, like their knees were knocking. They had lots of stories about their nervousness. And I thought maybe you could kind of comment on that. And also these poor guys who would get called up and then they would just wait for so long to actually get into a game. And some of them were convinced, I'm going to be one of those phantom guys, right? I'm never going to actually get to play, or it's late in the season and maybe in the last game or two, maybe they'll finally have pity on me and put me in the game.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of stories about some, players getting called out from the bullpen, and not really being able to feel their legs as they run from the bullpen to the mound, and then having those jelly legs, not really able to feel things correctly, throwing some wild pitches. In fact, there was one of the guys who was so nervous. I believe he hit I want to say it was the first two out of three batters he faced. Now, what makes this story even more interesting is that the two teams had gotten to a fight either the day before or the 2 days before. He gets ejected from his major league debut as a result. Now, it's not him trying to, do a nuke from, Bull Durham announcing his presence with authority. He is genuinely nervous and he hits two of the first three guys, gets yanked because coincidentally the teams had gotten in a fight before. Definitely stories like that. There are stories of guys who, get the call from the bullpen. They start warming up in the bullpen, and the first couple pitches to the bullpen pitcher or bullpen catcher are well over their heads. Bouncing around in the bullpen where people are just like, what's going on down there? Couple of ball players made some pretty bad errors just out of the nervousness when they're out on the field. Definitely an orientation process, even for the best of them, per se. But understandably so. I mean, I'm 46 years old and I still dream of taking the field at Candlestick Park, which was demolished many years ago. And I have this dream where I'm in right field and a ball comes to me, and for some reason I can't throw it. It's like I'm like Smalls in the Sandlot. So I couldn't imagine actually being a major leaguer and having a similar situation like that, but there are definitely some guys who did that. Now you're talking also about guys who got called up multiple times or had to wait multiple times or like a long time before they got actually into a game. Um, One of my favorite stories in the book is actually a guy on the Orioles, Mike Belforio. He in 2013 he got called up 3 times. He gets called up. I want to say it was in May. His whole family shows up for the few games that he's in the major leagues. Doesn't get into a game. He gets sent back down. He gets called back up a few months later. Same exact thing happens. Okay, he gets called up as a September call up. He's with the team for a few weeks. Doesn't see any action. It's finally the last series, um, the very last series against the Red Sox at Camden Yards. He gets into a single major league game. This is his whole career. 3 call-ups, 1 single major league game. First batter he faces is David Ortiz. Guess what David Ortiz does? Hits a home run. He says he was extremely upset at the time, but obviously 12 years later, it makes a heck of a story, right? So yeah, there are definitely a lot of stories like that. There are some players that are perennial all-stars in the book, but I always tended to gravitate toward those guys who had a couple of just a cup of coffee or two. And personally too, I think that it's more interesting if a guy spends a half dozen, 8, 10 years in the minor leagues before getting their opportunity, as opposed to a number one pick, who makes his second spring training. So there's quite a diverse amount of stories in the book. But yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying as far as some of those stories. I tend to like those a little bit more, actually.
Stu, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Zach. I'll be back later after everybody else has had a chance with a couple of questions, but my question is a technical one. I go back to the days of recording interviews on the telephone with a cassette tape recorder, and I really had a device that hooked up nicely, and we've probably all used that suction cup thing on the phone. What did you do for the phone interviews? Is there a good technology for, and I take it this is off your iPhone, and I know there's devices to record off iPhone, but you can't record when you're talking because they want to make sure you get permission. I mean, did you have a good technical way of capturing these phone conversations?
Yeah, so actually, I did 2 different ways. So I had an app on my phone called Rev. Rev is a call recorder app. Um, And then it also provides an opportunity for you to send the audio recording to them to assist with the transcription service as well. So I used that. What you would do is you would either call the player and then let them know, hey, I'm going to connect with this app, or you would call through the app and then connect with the player that way. The thing is, though, there is a little bit of a delay, and it would indicate, there was a beep, and then it was said, this call is being recorded or whatnot. But you could record that way. In addition to that, I did almost all of my interviews on speakerphone. That way, I could record it through the Rev app, and I also recorded through a micro recorder as well to make sure that I at least had a backup if one of the two went wrong. But that's the avenue I took on for these particular interviews.
Okay, I know Rev, I've used that for transcriptions. Costs a few bucks, but
Mhm.
for all of us who have done that, I'll check out their app too. But it does give a little delay, so you let the
Mhm.
person know that you're recording and make sure it's okay.
Bob?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for doing this, Zach, and my apologies for the
You're welcome.
technical problems starting up here, though. But my question is, or my comment, I should say, is that when I started reading this book, you put a really good hook in that first chapter with Gene Tennis, because his story
Oh,
is so unique. I mean, to be told that he's going to be going up to the A's and then he's going to be catching Catfish Hunter in 2 days was pretty remarkable, though. That was a wonderful hook for the book. So thank you.
yeah. I mean, he was fun to talk to too. He was very blunt and very candid and just kind of an entertaining personality. But yeah, he actually had spent a few years as a utility player uh, in the A's minor league system too. And when you're a utility player in the low minor leagues, I mean, he kind of saw the writing on the wall. And I want to say it was 1967, maybe 1968, where he finally went to the A's and said, "Hey, look, you need to actually give me a position or give me a little bit more opportunity, or I'm just going to hang him up." And they ended up converting him to primarily a catcher. And he only had about a year and a half of catching experience before he gets that call up to the big leagues. And he's catching, Catfish Hunter in his very first game. And I can't remember if it was first game or second, but I think he was facing as a hitter. I think he was facing Denny McLain too. So obviously Denny McLain in the late '60s was ridiculous. So definitely had a whirlwind of a start to his major league career. But obviously, I mean, he ended up being a longtime major leaguer, a longtime major league coach. And to think that he was a utility player in the minor leagues that was considering hanging him up long before, almost. Probably a 35-year career is really kind of remarkable and interesting.
I
Yeah,
think
his
follow
definitely
up.
one of my favorite players on that Oakland A's team, and I was kind of surprised. You really get to see the vulnerability of some of these people when I think Tennis made a comment about him having doubts about his catching ability for since he had been converted rather recently.
But he also
Yeah.
didn't seem impressed by McLean's pitching. It's because he's said to you that I was shaking my head. How's this guy getting me out with that stuff? So he didn't apparently think that McLean was all that he expected him to be.
Well, I mean, he was surprised. There's been numerous players that had that same challenge. I mean, it's just a matter of a particular player that a particular pitcher that may have, late minute, last moment movement on a ball or just extremely good location to where it's a little bit deceiving. I mean, I think even somebody like, a Greg Maddux obviously wasn't an overly powering pitcher. And a lot of people kind of think of Greg Maddux as, somebody that's, great, but he wasn't, an overpowering pitcher. He was just able to do what he needed to do to get guys out. And I think that's what, McLean kind of was in the late '60s. Obviously, McLean's career, you know, as one of the top pitchers in baseball didn't last very long. But he was able to make do with what he had.
Got some other questions? Come on, this is usually a talkative group.
Can I ask? Oh, John, did you want to ask? I've got
Oh,
another one. I
no,
didn't
I
get
was
my
just
hand up.
giggling. Go ahead,
Uh,
Stu, if you got some.
You're gonna do another book, you said, Zach, and when you talk to these guys, I mean, I think it's Steve Luber. It was about 5 years later. He took a no hitter, 2 out in the ninth in Texas. Did you ever get that far into the careers with these guys? And who was the phantom player that you talked to, or as Bill Hickman calls the Bill Sharman Society of players? I can remember one for the
Yeah.
Twins. He was up 3 weeks, and I saw him warming up in the bullpen, and Gene Mock never put him in. I was told this guy is kind of a smart ass and probably rubbed Gene the wrong way. But who was your phantom player you talked to?
Yeah. So for the first question was no, I generally did not get that far into the career. I pretty much, when I reached out to players, I asked them for 15, 20 minutes. So 15, 20 minutes, I basically focused on, you know, how they, realized they had the talent and skills to become a major leaguer, what the orientation process was to the minor leagues, how they got the call, what the orientation process was when they got walked in that major league clubhouse for the first time and what it felt like for their debut. Now, I didn't even get into game details really, unless the player brought that up because I wanted to focus more on the human interest side of things and the behind the scenes stuff as opposed to the games themselves. I kind of felt that readers, if they wanted to do additional stuff, they could, probably find that out within 30 seconds of a Google search on, baseball reference or whatnot. The Phantom Major Leaguer that I had included was a guy by the name of Andy Shiblo. Came up, I believe it was 2002 with the Padres. And he was the guy that was only up for 2 days. And he gets a call from the bullpen. It's late in the game. And there's one out. I want to say it was the bottom of the eighth. There's one out, there's one runner on, and a call to the bullpen is, hey, warm up. If this hitter gets on base, you're coming into the game. All right. Now the hitter gets a hit. All right. So he's ready to get in. But in the whole moment, the runner on base tries to score and gets thrown out at home. All right. The hitter then tries to go over to second base and gets tossed at second. 3 outs. It's the end of the inning. Goes into the ninth, and it's the end of the game there. So there's no bottom of the ninth. That's about as close as you can get without getting. I mean, other than maybe if you're Larry Yount, right? I mean, that's almost as close as you can get without actually becoming and Larry Yount is still considered technically a major leaguer because he was announced, right? But that's so I can't imagine getting any closer to that, and then just having it kind of ripped away from you. But the next night he's on the plane, on the road with the Padres. Bruce Bochy calls him up and says, "Hey, man, I'm sorry, but you're getting sent back down." And that was it. Didn't get another opportunity. I see a guy named Dave.
Yeah, Zach, of all the thousands of players that have come up in the majors since the 60s, how did you select these 109 to interview?
It was very easy. If they were a former major leaguer and they were willing to talk to me, they met my criteria. I thought of it this way, like I'm an unknown author. Low budget book. So I wasn't going after, and this is my first book too, right? So I wasn't going after guys that required a publicist or an agent or whatnot to filter things. I was, and I tended to kind of prefer, the guys who, had that, opportunity to become a major leaguer, but didn't necessarily reach that incredible high status. Because I just kind of like the human interest side of those particular stories anyways. I wouldn't be surprised if about 2/3 of the players that I spoke to, I actually connected through social media. So what I would do on either Facebook or Twitter at the time, is I would search like MLB alum or former major leaguer or something like that. And after you follow a few on Twitter or become friends with a few on Facebook, the crazy algorithms start working, and then your suggested friends or your suggested followers tend to be more major leaguers. So I just reach out to them, kind of take a shotgun approach, and ask them for 15, 20 minutes of their time. The vast majority of them, there are a few that said no. But the vast majority of them would either, would be, relatively, cooperative and appreciative that they were even just remembered and given the opportunity to be part of the book.
Thank you.
Talk a little bit, Zach, about the release process then that you had to go through to actually get the story of each of these guys into the book.
So that was a bit of a challenge. So, I don't want to say that because I still got a decent return on the releases. So Green Zach, why I say Green is inexperienced. I'm doing these interviews for a few years, and I let the players know, this is what the situation is. I'm gonna, take your interviews, turn it into first person narratives. Hopefully, within the next, few years, there'll be a book. And it was just kind of like, I guess you could not really a handshake deal, but just agreement that that would be it, right? Um, and then when I started talking to publishers, obviously publishers want to cover their behinds, right? Um, so they don't do the, okay, well, we had an agreement by the phone type of deal. They want to make sure that there's some sort of documented proof that it's cool, right? Um, so um, when I got the when I think it was SABR, it was the SABR, what was it, 2022 in Baltimore. When I started talking to some of the publishers after a few months, I went back and forth with McFarlane a while. They eventually gave me a contract, but they required that I go out and I get the actual signed releases. Now, keep in mind, some of these guys I hadn't had any kind of conversation with for 3 years, right? So some of these guys were cold calls or guys I had talked to for 15 minutes 3 years ago, and I had actually interviewed 149 players. So when I went back out, some of these guys are probably like, "Who the hell is Zak Ford?" Right? But luckily, I still was able to get a pretty good response. 109 out of 149 interviews, still pretty solid. And it worked out well too, because McFarlane wanted me to be at 90,000 words. All right. I don't know what this means. If any of you have any experience writing books or putting together manuscripts or whatnot, okay, but they wanted me to be at 90,000 words for this type of book. Um, and I'm doing my math as I'm transcribing new stories and stuff like that and bringing stories in and putting together things in the book manuscript. And I'm like, this is going to be tight. So I reached out to Gary Mitchum, the great editor over at McFarlane, and I said, hey, man, I don't think I'm going to be at 90,000 words. It's going to be really hard. Can I get up to 95? He's like, all right, if you're not more than 95, you're going to be fine. So I get 109 stories. Okay. And I'm putting all the 109 stories into one document, and I have my preface and my introduction in a separate document. I cut and paste my preface and introduction into the book manuscript. I am at 95,000 words exact. I knew I was going to be within a few hundred, but for me to be exact was almost scary. It was almost scary perfect. So if I had been at 110, 111, they would have probably been like, hey, man, we already gave you the permission to go up another 5,000 words. You're going to have to do some cutting. So luckily, I didn't have to do that. But that's how I ended up with 109. Just 100% coincidence. It hit 95,000 words perfect. 100% luck. Really weird luck, but hey, I'll take it.
That's a great story. Go ahead, John.
Oh, which John?
John Buckeye.
I did I have my hand raised or something? I don't necessarily have a question.
Oh, okay. I thought you were unmuted, so I thought you were going to jump in here.
Well, I can unmute from my headset here, so sometimes I'm just going back and forth. I won't unmute myself now, Ed.
Is there a second volume for this?
I don't think so, because I'm going to be doing the next up book, which will be on the post-playing career transitions. I really did like, this, the concept of this book, and I was very surprised nobody else had come up with it. Because you can kind of see these viral videos, you see ESPN or MLB Network, Every year there's a few that kind of go viral of, somebody calling his mom and saying, hey, I'm getting called up, and it's been like a dozen years in the minor leagues. And these kind of, these stories float around, but nobody had really captured it in book form. So I just got lucky, I guess, with the idea being the right time.
Well, the other thing
And I just put a chat in there. If you're interested in getting the book, just shoot me an email, and I'll make sure to get one to you when I get um, the new shipment in next week.
I think John does have a question now, but I was going to say, having done one book with McFarlane and a chapter in one that's coming out later this year, there probably wasn't enough complimentary copies for you to potentially send one to every player who might have liked to have a copy of it.
No, absolutely not. So yeah, to say I'm in the red on this would be an understatement. So I joked, I half joked. I mean, it was my dream to put a baseball book together since I was a little kid. So as this process was going, I half joked that my goal was to have a book published and not lose 10 grand. So I did accomplish that lofty goal of not losing 10 grand. Um, Upfront costs were probably about 8 grand, primarily transcription services. To be candid, I hate transcribing. It's so tedious and time consuming. I ended up having that service done. But with, advertisements, comp books, all that type of stuff, ended up being about $8,000. So I've recouped a little bit more than about half that. So definitely not a moneymaker. But yeah, I think McFarlane gives you 10 comp books. So I mean, I think it's a small price to pay. I mean, I obviously, wasn't able to provide the players with any kind of royalties or anything like that, but I did provide them each with a complimentary book.
That's good. Okay, John, go ahead.
Yeah, my thought that just kind of occurred to me was how in the past few years, MLB has stopped doing, like, you can basically bring your whole 40-man roster up to the bigs in September, so it kind of maybe whittles down the number of these guys that are kind of going to get like a cheap end of season um, appearance, obviously a debut for a lot of them. Do you think that maybe even makes getting a major league appearance a little bit more special than it used to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always going to be special. I mean, regardless of whether or not it was, in the 80s, 90s, now, whatever. But I do think it's, made things a little bit more challenging, definitely. Um, and I mean, I didn't mind when the rosters were a little bit bigger at the end of the season because, I mean, look, I'm not really a stats guy. I'm not a hardcore academic style research type guy. I'm one of the baseball fans who likes fluffy human interest stories, right? So, when these guys are getting called up and, the commentators are saying, oh, John Smith played, 12 years in the minor leagues and he's finally getting this opportunity. And I mean, yeah, it could be a little bit of a gift call up, right? Um, but I mean, I always kind of gravitated to those stories as well. But I would agree that probably, not probably. I mean, even with all the roster changes and manipulations that are permitted now with injured lists and all that type of stuff, um, I think it does become a little bit more of a challenge nowadays.
I think we've got time for one more. Bob, did you have a question? I think you're so muted.
Oh, no. Question I had for Zak is, I noticed on your biography you're involved with the Pacific Coast League Historical Society, I believe.
Mhm.
You ever consider doing a Pacific Coast League historical book?
I will. That's my main lofty goal. And I think it will be probably more of a personal memoir. I had kind of a weird, I don't want to say weird, but a very unique childhood and teen years and early adult life. Because I, I had my uncle who played in the Pacific Coast League. And as a teenager, I got really interested in that. That was kind of my escape from being an awkward, you know, dorky, junior high kid, was really getting into baseball and getting into the Pacific Coast League. So, I got to become friends with a lot of my uncle's former teammates and opponents. I'd go to these reunions with my uncle, the Pacific Coast League reunions. And I became friends with guys who played with and against Babe Ruth. I got to, Frankie Crissetti. I don't know how many of you have heard of Frankie Crissetti, but longtime Yankees player and coach. But like my dad used to drive me around even before I got my license to interview these guys when I was a kid. We would go we visit Frankie Crissetti in his little home in Stockton, and he has this little baseball room. There's, stuff signed by Babe Ruth. It's like walking into that guy's room in the Sandlot. At the end. And my dad and I, it was a bonding experience with my dad and I too. And at the end of our interview, Frankie Crissetti goes, "Hey, stay right here. I'll be back in a few minutes. I got something to show you." He comes back with his 1932 World Series ring, and I actually got to wear it. The weird stories like that from the Pacific Coast League. Yeah. It's more of a personal thing for me, but I do think that there's at least something. There's a little monkey on my back that says, "Hey, you need to share some of these stories of your friendships, these your unique friendships with some guys who are 70 years your senior." I took public buses to interview some of these guys. I became friends with a lot of these guys. Red Adams, longtime Dodgers pitching coach, became a really good friend of mine. And I was able to reconnect with him actually just a few years ago before he died. And I started this tradition. I'm a Giants fan, but I started a tradition of going to Dodger Stadium each year and wearing my Red Adams jersey. I got a weird, kind of unique connection to the Pacific Coast League. So ultimately, I think that's probably going to be book number 3. Once I get done with Next Up, I need to do some sort of personal memoir.
Well, I'm sure we could continue to talk all night, but we probably should wrap it up. And thanks, Zach, so much for the evening and for getting that first book done and having, I think, a lot of success. I think there's just a heck of a lot of fans who read the book, and certainly there's a couple of stories in there that they really just say, "Oh, that's a great story," or there's just some oddities about the particular call up that just kind of make you smile and say, what.
Yeah.
But I often marvel at some of these players who can remember, like Greg Maddux, who remembers pitch counts and all this stuff. And I think, seriously, you guys. But one thing you figure, every single guy who got to the major leagues, they remember their first, getting called up in their first game. It's like that. That's something you don't forget. That's kind of frozen in time in your mind, exactly how all that was. And I think your idea of kind of a feel-good book, that this has got to really hit a home run on that score, because that's for all these guys and fans who live vicariously through players. It's like, yeah, that's really neat. you know, those stories are all really quite good.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, in a way, I lived, you know, vicariously through them when I was interviewing. I mean, I especially loved interviewing the guys, you know, from the '80s and early '90s, when I was a, you know, relatively young baseball fan, and I saw these guys. So, and you know, a lot of these guys too, you know, I keep in regular contact with. So, you know, to see them as a, you know, as a kid, and you know, baseball players were not human beings to me when I was a kid. They were like godlike superheroes put on baseball fields to, you know, show you know, superhuman strength and skills. So, you know, 35 years later, to become friends, you know, through this book with some of the guys that I had looked up to as a child, is pretty cool. Very cool.
So any parting questions from anybody? Otherwise, I apologize again for the issues at the beginning, but I think ultimately we had a great evening, and you know, that's ultimately the goal of these sessions. So if you haven't already acquired a copy of the book, do so. It'll, you know, it'll make a nice addition. As some of you can see, I've got plenty.
Yeah, yeah, quite a library behind you.
So, you know, and I'll bring it along with me down to Fort Worth if you're expecting to be at SABR National this year.
Probably won't be able to make it this year, but I try and do probably every 2 years. So hopefully maybe in 2026.
Yeah, well, you've got one of those challenges that people on either coast have. It's like, okay, you know, how expensive is it going to be for me to go across the country, as opposed to in your situation?
I also just sent my first kid off to college, and
Oh,
he just moved out just within the last
Man.
week and a half. So that's another labor of, you know, level of analysis I have to do too, as far as my where I'm putting money.
yeah. Well, thanks again so much, Zak. I'll
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor, and I really appreciate you guys joining me. And it was fun chatting. And you know, if you know, if any of you are on, you know, social media, or you have any questions that pop up, you know, my email I put in the chat there, just zakford@gmail.com. Just remember it's ZAK. And definitely would love to, you know, answer anything else if something pops in your head a little bit later. So thanks again for having me, though.
That's right. Well, I'll join with Brenda in clapping and saying thank you, and I'll go ahead and turn off the recording.
Thanks, Zak.
Yeah. Thanks, Zak.
Thanks. Have a great night, everybody.
See you
See you
guys.
later.